Hello, friends. I hope everybody is well. This is article number 4 of for our team 2. Oh gosh, let's see if this is going to be lots of fun. Okay, let me see if that will stop it from highlighting everything. So the 4th article is looking at a randomized controlled trial, looking at home-based resistance exercise compared to range of motion exercises and gym exercises twice a week. So the resistance, home-based resistance aerobic program is the same one we have been looking at in the first 3 articles. And this is a very interesting study because it incorporates different initial exercise, and then everybody is doing the general going to the gym exercises, and then they are followed up for 2 years. So let's have a look. Okay. So again, it's an article that is originating in Sweden with Helene and good friends Lee and Maryam, Ingela, and some folks from Malmo as well, and of course Ingrid, Lundberg. So this study encapsulates in the abstract here. It's a bit dense, the abstract, just in terms because the exercise design strategy for the different groups and how they were followed on and how they were able to switch groups is a little bit complicated. Not complicated, but it's intricate. So I think we're going to cut right into the study because I already gave you a little background, and they actually were only able to recruit 19 patients total, but within that they were able to establish that everybody benefited from exercise with the resistance exercise group actually further benefiting in terms of aerobics. But what was very important here is that they established that exercise appears to be safe in early disease and active disease. And that's an important distinction between this article and the other articles, is because here we're looking at patients that have recent onset active disease and starting out on high doses of prednisone and newly initiated immunosuppressants. And so it's a different group it's a different group than we've looked at before, because the last groups were very stable and they were not responsive to immunosuppressants. They did not have inflammatory muscle biopsies at that point, but they still had low residual muscle function. And as you probably are aware, we've spoken a number of times about how there was a false understanding regarding the effects of exercise in early myositis, recent onset myositis, where the disease was active, that there could be harm and that exercise could be further destroying muscle cells. But this shows that's demonstrated that this is not the case. Even though it was a small study, the results are consistent. So here we are in the introduction. A lot of this you know already from having done the other 3 articles. The hypothesis that I just discussed, the false hypothesis that I had just discussed regarding exercise, is described in here. And so their aim of the study was to evaluate the home resistance program for 12 weeks, followed by another 12 weeks of doing what the control group, or the quote-unquote placebo group, which is not really placebo in this case. They're just given something different to do that may not have been thought to be as effective, perhaps, is what this group was getting. But, right. And then they were invited to stay on and to complete 2 years, so that assessments could be made to see how exercise impacted people over time. So the design of the study is there were 3 centers in Stockholm, at Karolinska Stockholm, I think in Solna and Hudiker, if I'm correct, and also another site in Malmo, Sweden. The regular inclusion criteria that you would anticipate, which is the Bohan and Peter criteria for myositis. They excluded people who had severe osteoporosis, as well as anybody that had malignancy or cardiovascular disease that would contradict exercise. And of the 23 people that were screened, 3 were excluded because of severe osteoporosis and 1 for heart involvement. And all patients were treated with high-dose prednisolone in the beginning in order to try to control the myositis, which was at 0.75 milligrams per kilogram per day. So that's quite a lot. So it's high dose. And then concomitantly, patients were also started on an immunosuppressant, right? So you start immunosuppressants with the hope of tapering off the steroids to as low as we could possibly go. Okay. So I don't see an active exclusion of IBM, but that would have been excluded. And we can confer with the authors about that. Ethics approval. So the clinical assessments, the main outcome measure, the primary outcome measure is one that we know very well, which is the functional index, right? It's where you repeat a movement to the metronome. In several different muscle groups. And then the secondary outcome measure was aerobic capacity, and how this was measured was by using a treadmill for 8 minutes. And so what they did is they calculated the maximal heart rate for patients. And so suboptimal was between 50 and 70%. And so the speed was calibrated towards that. So they started 4 minutes flat, and then the next 4 minutes was on a 5% slope incline. And then measures were taken, and I put a little video in the email for folks. And then to measure the disease status, the patient perceived disease status, health status, not the disease status, but overall health status, again, was the Nottingham Health Profile, which was used in the last article, Article 3, if you recall. And that had 5 domains: physical function, pain, sleep, energy, and social. And scoring 0 to 100, with the highest being the worst. And it's 45 questions, which makes it kind of long. And disease activity was measured by the CPK or CK levels, and also by the degree of muscle inflammation in the muscle biopsy. So again, like in the first 2 studies we saw, there was baseline muscle biopsy, and then they repeated muscle biopsy at 24 weeks. And then in this case, they were looking at the extent of inflammation and how much it rolled back, which doesn't necessarily mean it was from the exercise, but it could be from the immunosuppressants as well. But an important issue here is that if in the in the active exercise group with the resistance training, if the second muscle biopsy looked good, then that goes to confirm that there was no inciting of disease activity because of exercise and no damage done because of exercise, as well as the CK remaining or being at a good level, especially compared to the control group at 24 weeks, which means that muscle cells weren't breaking and spilling the CK. That's the enzyme inside the muscle. So, you know how they do it. You take one muscle biopsy on one leg for the beginning, and then the other muscle biopsy, the other leg at the final time, so that there's no artifact from past scarring and healing of the trauma from the muscle biopsy. And again, you know, it's the sutureless muscle biopsy, and you can see our videos that we made on that. That's also in the email. Yeah, and so what's really great about this study is it has a follow-up period. It's 24 weeks, and it's a single-blinded randomized control study. So participants were randomized using a table. This is done a little chart, and you count along. It's kind of interesting, a little confusing, but it's a very valid way. It's the way of doing it. If you don't have a new fancy randomization software, which pretty much does the same thing. So okay, so single blind, meaning that it seemed that it was the patients who were blind, the patients who were not blinded, but everybody else in interacting with that patient was, I think, especially the assessors. And they did a very interesting thing, like, so, yeah. Oh, I won't go into that detail. You'll read it here. But so the assessor was blinded as to what exercise group they were in. And it also appears that the rheumatologists were also blinded. Yeah. And they kind of did this switch thing where this supervisors who taught the exercises were from the other institution. So they were handling the other institution's patients. It looks like very interesting. Okay, so the exercise group, you know this program. 5 days a week of the resistance exercise, and 5 days a week of 15 minutes walking. They did that for 12 weeks, and then they were encouraged to continue with twice a week home gym exercise for another 12 weeks. And they could do the gym exercises as an alternative to the home exercises. And the control group was instructed to perform just 15 minutes of range of motion exercises program for 5 days a week. So the range of motion was the actual, I don't want to say placebo, but because it is an intervention of a type, but it is it's a different intervention. It's not a resistance training, let's put it that way. And so, right, and so they did, the control group did that for 24 weeks without any telephone support. So, and that seems to be a difference, because for the first 12 weeks, it seems that the exercise group did get telephone support each week. And they got training, and both groups had a diary, it appears, where they so compliance was tracked really well for both of these groups. So this is how the groups looked at the beginning, baseline demographics, and they were both the same, except that for the exercise group actually had a worse score for the Nottingham health profile. Interestingly, so the exercise group did, the one that got the intervention. So here they talk about the exercise program, which you know about, and here they talk about the statistical analysis. So they begin with, and I really like this, and I think that's one thing that we should probably advocate for in the guidelines, is up front, folks should be describing compliance in the results, because that's going to make a difference to the rest of the interpretation of the results, how compliant the folks were and the difference in the group. So there's, as you can see, there's a long paragraph on the compliance, and also loss to follow-up. And there's going to be a chart that I'll show you in a second about that, which is going to be easier than talking this through at least for my eyes anyway. But one thing that's important to recognize is that 2 patients in the exercise group died. And they died during the following 12 weeks, one for not previously diagnosed ovarian cancer, and then the other patient developed rapidly progressive interstitial lung disease. And there was another patient, I think, that left the group, and I cannot remember where is that. But you'll see it, you'll read it. And then in the control group, there's just one patient who didn't do those range of motion exercises, owed to poor eyesight, for example, but the other 8 patients did. So the effects that were found after 24 weeks well, first of all, they say that there was no statistical difference, as I have already mentioned, between disability in the 2 groups at baseline, but the exercise group, like I said, rated poor health. I'll come back to that in a minute, that chart. But after 4 weeks, both groups had improved muscle performance and anaerobic capacity compared to baseline. But the exercise group, it was somewhere in here, sorry, they improved better aerobically. They had more aerobic improvement statistically than, I believe statistically, than the control group. And here also it describes the exercise group improved in the Nottingham Health Profile domain of energy as compared to the control group, whereby the control group had improved in sleep, interestingly enough. So after 24 weeks, that was just perceived health and disability. And then so after 24 weeks, the effects of everything else. So I kind of jumped the gun talking about that. So at baseline, the CPK levels were respectively, though they tell us what they were here. So they were normal, and that was probably because of the prednisone. Thankfully, they had a good response. When the exercise, so respectively significantly lower compared to the time of diagnosis. The exercise group yeah, and so but they were still lower. So so again, we're talking within group, pre and post within each group. So the group compared with itself from beginning to after. At 24 weeks, they both groups had similar CK levels, and in terms of how much prednisone they were able to get off of, so the exercise group was able to get to a slightly lower dose than the control group. I didn't see where, though, that was significant, so I'd like to see that. So both were able to taper well at the end of 24 weeks, because they were probably on like 60 when they started. If 0.75 mg per kg, just generally speaking, would probably be around that much. So the initial biopsy and repeated results were of the exercise group showed the presence of inflammatory infiltrates in 6, absence in 2, but at week 24, no patient in the exercise group had any inflammatory infiltrates. And remember, that's important because that establishes safety. In the control group, biopsies were available for 7 patients at the time of diagnosis, and at 24 weeks, 5 showed presence and 2 showed absence of inflammation. At week 24, only 1 patient still had inflammatory infiltrates. That's in the control group. And then now they're talking about exercise compliance in the year following. And we'll look at a chart for that. And then they're looking here at the possible long-term influence on disability and disease as measured by the functional index and the aerobic capacity, and then the Nottingham Health Profile. So at week 52, both groups improved performance, but the EG group was statistically significant. So I was right, improved muscle performance and aerobic capacity. I put a little note in our email about what is an ITT, which is intention to treat, which means that regardless of whether the patient dropped out or even if they never got the intervention, we still include them in the analysis. And I put a link there so you could see the pros and cons of what that means. It's kind of, it's interesting. And one of the things we'll talk about, well, I'll tell you now, the intention to treat analysis helped with this because that the power calculation was not disclosed if it was done, and the recruitment was kind of was low for the period of time that they did the study. And so in order to try to maximize the data, they do an intention to treat analysis by keeping everybody in. And maybe we'll be able to get Helene to come on the phone and kind of talk a little bit about that with us, because it's very interesting. So what else do I want to share about this? So the exercise group also improved in the domain of energy at week 52 and 04, continued improvement. So this was really interesting. While the control group remained unchanged. And for both groups, the CPK level, right, marker of disease activity, but also marker of damage, that also remained stable in that period of time. Oh dear, stop, please go. Okay, so let's go look at these charts just to overview. Sometimes they just bug me out, but this is a consort diagram here, and what the consort, I'm going to try to close this a bit so you can see what's happening, just so you can see this an overview of how it looks. And consort a diagram, what it does is it shows you what happens from before the start of the study, who was screened, who stayed in the study, who fell out, why they fell out, why they screen failed, meaning, why did why weren't they included? And so, yeah, so I'm going to walk you through this. So, 23 patients were screened, but 4 were excluded because they did not meet inclusion criteria. But nobody refused to participate, and nobody declined for personal reasons. So they did, for some reason, like I think 3 of them had severe osteoporosis, and so there was I guess a fear of bone damage. But exercise and resistance exercise, by the way, as you probably know, is very good for osteoporosis. However, the severity was probably worrisome. The other person could not participate because of the cardiovascular issues. And remember, that was in screening. So ultimately, four people were excluded from those screened, and then the left 19 patients that were randomized. And there was one particular person during randomization that did not speak about the study to any of the folks that were involved. And so there were 10 that got randomized to the exercise group, 9 that got to the control group, and so allocated to the exercise group and received the intervention. So they're just backing up here to say that they received it. So in this here, it talks about the allocation of patients. You can see on the sidebar. And then here's the allocation of care providers. So this is the exercise group, remember on the left. So the care providers, because there was two centers. Well, originally there were 3, so I'm not sure what happened. Maybe it's the 2 centers, Solna, Karolinska Center, Solna, and Hudica. But let's see, maybe just doesn't matter, we can ask Helene. But in any case, patients treated at the Karolinska Center was 10, but none of the exercise group was treated at Malmö. And then in terms of the control group, 1 was in Malmö and 8 was at the Karolinska. So that's interesting in terms of randomization, because you would have thought that they might have been maybe it was determined by where the patients were enrolled from. And then so the next box we're looking at is here we go, follow-up 24 weeks. So here we're talking about the status of patients. So in the follow-up 24 weeks, after the first 12 weeks, after the second 12 weeks, then coming to the 24 weeks, we find that 2 patients had dropped out of the exercise group because they had died. Nobody in the control group dropped out. And then here, the analysis of the patients. So in the exercise group, that left 8 in the exercise group to be analyzed. Wait a second here. Yeah, so excluded from analysis seems to have been 0. But, that's strange, because they would have been, maybe the intention to treat was a post hoc, I'm not sure. And then everyone was analyzed in the control group. And then here in the follow-up period, the year that from 52 weeks to 104 weeks, lost to follow-up were the 2 patients that passed away and excluded from analysis. Nobody was excluded from analysis, but analyzed at 104 week was 6 and 8. I'm getting a little bit lost here. And then it seems here that nobody was excluded. N equals 6. I think some people were just not exercising. we'll get more information on that. And then, so this chart this chart reflects the exercise group. These were all the 10 patients in the exercise group. And you can see their gender, you can see their age, you can see their diagnosis, poly or dermatomyositis. And here you have the duration in months since diagnosis. So you can see that these were people who were really newly diagnosed. And so here we're talking about the compliance. In the first 12 weeks, what percent of the exercise program do they do? So remember, it's 5 days a week, and 5 times 12 is 60. So they should have had 60 home exercise sessions. And so here you see that they have the percentages here: 73% compliance, 30, 100, 66, 92, 75, 100. There you go. And then in terms of the compliance with walking, again, 5 days a week for 12 weeks. So that's 60 walking sessions. And this describes how compliant they were in percentage. And then for the following part, the next 12 weeks, so this is broken up into how many times per week people exercised and walked. So for example, this person exercised once a week and walked 3 times a week. And this person number 4 did not do either. And this person number 8, which I think these were the people that ultimately got very sick and were not able to. And this is the same data for weeks 24 for far out to the second year. And here's the data for the control group. How many complied with the range of motion exercise. And this was for the whole 24 weeks. So that's why this is 120 and not 60, because this is actually the 24-week period, and 24 times 5 is 120. And this, yeah, and these were all the same. Okay. And here, so what they did do is that they offered the resistance training program at 24 weeks to the control group. After the 24 weeks, they got the data they wanted. Here you go. If you want to try this resistance program exercise, you can. But only 4 people wanted to. Only 4 patients, 13, 14, 17, and 18. The others felt that they were really just too tired to do it. And that is very interesting. So here's another indicator of this energy issue in the patients that were able to get resistance exercise. So that was very interesting. And that ties in very nicely to the second article we read about how the resistance exercise is increasing the type 1 slow twitch fibers that are for endurance, and how endurance is so closely tied to fatigue. Very interesting, isn't it? So this is something interesting to consider for our guidelines. So here you go. These are buggy to me, but remember, this talks about the whiskers, the confidence intervals, and each of these bars are describing the period of weeks. So this is baseline, 0 weeks. This is at week 24. This is at week 52. This dotted one is at week 78. This solid one is at 104. And yeah. What is this boxy one? Oh, 104 with the intention to treat analysis. So that's how it panned out. And so what this is looking at, these are looking at the F functional index scores. And remember, the higher the score, the higher the functional index score, the the crikey. Oh no, I'm confusing myself. I'm not going to say anything because I think I'm going to say it wrong. We'll just look it up. Especially because I just did an MMT today, which was 114 points. So I'm just getting a little bit confused in my scales. So, okay, let's see. Okay. Yeah. But my guess is that 64 is worse. Gosh, I don't hold me to that though, please. And so we're just really comparing where people sit in where the groups as a whole sat on the scores. And so remember that these whiskers, when they're closer in, means that we feel confident that the bottom, the values are correct. So we believe this end more closely than that end. Okay, and here we are looking at the aerobic capacity. And this is the exercise group on the left and the control group on the right. And we know that there were significant differences with the change in the exercise group. And I'm just going to move on. I didn't really examine this very closely, but basically these different colors are okay. Sorry. So this is the graph on the left is for the exercise group. Graph on the right is for the control group. These are the scores for for the functional index. So this is how each person looked. This is the 10 patients, patient 1 through patient 10. And so we can see how the functional index changed over time. So in the beginning, so we can see that this is the black is the 24 group, gray is the group period, gray is at 52 weeks, this light gray is at 104. So this tells us how people did over time. We can get this nice kind of intimate view. And here we can see what happened with the control groups. And then this one here, it's the same thing, left, control, exercise group, right, control group, but now we're looking at the change in the aerobic capacity. And so we can see how one individual person's journey. Okay. Now to the discussion. So interesting things in the discussion that was pointed out was that, again, confirming the safety of a resistance program in combination with immunosuppressant therapy. So we're not sure if there was any benefit. I have to plug in. Not sure if there was actually any benefit. Can say we can't confirm that based on the data. If we had more patients enrolled, we might have been able to. The intention to treat analysis helps a little bit with that. We know people increased in fatigue scores and their perceived energy and the aerobic capacity in the exercise group. So that's very interesting and worth holding on to. But one very important thing is that looking short-term and long-term, looking at 24 weeks, looking at 52 weeks, looking at 104 weeks, we saw that there was no harm, and it was very safe for folks to exercise. That is very important to establish. And again, the exercise group at the beginning, remember they had lower disease profile that they perceived. There was good compliance with the exercise group and overall with the control group. Remember, I think it's very important that we have to query exactly what the support system was and why it differed for these patients, because that could really influence results. But I doubt it. And what I would love to see is I would love to see the 24-week muscle biopsy data, looking at the muscle fibers and looking at the staining for ATPase, and looking at the immunohistochemistry for slow versus fast twitch fibers, especially the type 2C fibers that can go either way. Remember that from Article 2. So I think that would be extraordinarily useful follow-up in this study to try to demonstrate some actual supported difference. So I'm just trying to pluck things out of the discussion, important for you to make things easier for you when you read it. So during the first week, the improvement was the same in both groups in a similar manner. This could be reflective of the immunosuppressant therapy. Thank goodness for these medications. But again, safety was confirmed. So much of this I interjected in the rest of the. Oh, one thing that's important. So remember that we did the last study, Article 3, and they used the Nottingham health profile, and there was not a significant change, and it was almost like unmoved. And we had conjectured, well, maybe that's the wrong instrument, because when we looked back at the first article with the same exercise program, the SF36 was sensitive. So here they're making that exact same conjecture, that maybe they used the wrong instrument to measure health status. So the CK levels, again, were used to establish disease activity. The rapid reduction of CK levels from diagnosis to enrollment just confirmed that, thankfully, the patients were responsive to their medical treatment, and it is stabilized, which supported the safety of early exercise. Very good. So one limitation, well, we talk about the IMACS tools. They did not use those, nor the MDAT, which is the activity and damage tool, because it was not available at that time as of yet. And then one thing that they pointed out here is that concerning safety, they're in line with earlier studies. Patients with high disease activity in a study by Ingela improved by a mean of 3.7%. This is really interesting in the functional index scores. So we have the same measure, but theirs was a 3-week program. But we looked at ours at 24 weeks, and look, it's a huge difference, 3.7 to 44. So if we're going to try to assess in clinical trials, we have to look at the length of time that we're exercising folks if we want to see a difference. So 3 weeks is very likely just too short of time to demonstrate a difference. Hey, I plugged you in. Let me see, hold on. Oh, no, I didn't. I thought I did. So important limitation, again, I interjected this already, was the lack of power analysis and the low number of patients. And that may explain by the lack of significant between group differences, meaning, why it wasn't so strong, the exercise group in terms of functional index, but the aerobic capacity was great. They had a great significant follow-up. So they talk a little bit about the statistics here. Maybe if we have a chance, we could talk a little bit about how to analyze things in a parametric or non-parametric way. Non-parametric is a little kind of a renegade, very out-of-the-box sort of way of doing this, but that's when the data, you don't expect it to kind of pan out normal. So, so I think it was a worthy approach. And one other thing is the exercise intensity level was only defined for the walks. but it was not for their home resistance exercise. And that was a limitation to the study. So that maybe in future studies, there should be more hands-on in terms of resistance, increasing resistance for patients that are just plateauing, because you want to continue to get them strong and you want to keep them engaged and not bored, because they know the exercise is too easy for them. So they can do that over the phone, gradually adapting the program, helping patients increase their intensity. And they thought it could be a good idea to include a scale for the patient so that the patients could assess their level of exertion at home, maybe each week, or something like that, so that that would be another way to establish increasing intensity and need to increase intensity. And they also talked about the use of things like heart rate monitors, Fitbits, etc. That could increase compliance. And it could also be a nice way of keeping people engaged, and could be a very nice and non-harassing way of keeping a diary. They talk about the benefits of exercise to reduce glucocorticoid, meaning steroid side effects. And also habituating people to a healthier lifestyle, which is so important when you have an autoimmune disease, even if you're not even taking prednisone. Right. So we're coming to the end. Level of disability, various ones. What was I saying here? Oh yeah. So the recommendation is that disability assessments do be performed when introducing exercise to enable the adaptation of programs for the patient. So maybe we should be tailoring these patients individually beforehand to make sure that they're really getting the level of exercise that's going to benefit them. And so therefore we will be able to maybe see a strong difference from before and after. Though that they could not draw a conclusion on the effect of exercise in combination with medical treatment versus medical treatment alone, meaning was exercise an added benefit. There's definitely need for larger multi-center studies, and there are some things from this study that definitely support that this needs to be looked at further, such as the energy perception being higher 2 years out and constitutively higher in the exercise group, as well as the aerobic capacity increasing. And again, we need to see if they will look at those muscle biopsies that were done at 24 weeks between the groups. That's where I think there's some money, some treasure lying there. So thank you for your patience, and I hope this made this easier for you. And as always, we're so grateful for your participation, and it means so much to the Guidelines program. Thank you, and see you soon.